What would you do if you were inches away from defeat, time is running out, and thousands of people are watching you? How would you respond? Sounds pretty nerve-wracking, right? I mean, just like makes some of us shake in our boots a little bit if we're really honest. Well, that's exactly where Keith Bishop found himself in 1987. Keith Bishop was a professional football player for the Denver Broncos, and his team was playing the Cleveland Browns in the AFC Championship game. The winner of this would go to the Super Bowl, and so here's the situation that Bishop found himself in. The team is losing. The Denver Broncos are losing. They're backed up to their own end zone. They're on the 2-yard line. So one bad mistake, and the game is completely over. All of their hopes and desires are completely dashed away. Their backs are literally up against the wall, and time is running out. I mean, they're in the last few minutes of the game. And to make matters worse, the game is in Cleveland. And so all of the fans that are in the stadium are cheering against them. They're rooting for their demise. And so the Broncos come together for the very first play on this drive. They're on the 2-yard line. And Keith just comes in, and he's kind of taking in the whole moment, right? So he imagine the environment and the atmosphere that he's stepping into. He stops, he looks around at all the screaming fans, and they're just all ridicule coming straight at him. He looks at the scoreboard, sees that they're down, and he sees the last few minutes that are on the scoreboard, and then he turns to his teammates. And whenever he turns to his teammates, all he sees is utter fear in all of them, right? Like their faces are like drooped down. They're in complete fear. And here's what Keith says to them. Fellas, we've got them right where we want them. Not what any of us would say, right? Like, this is the last situation that I'd possibly want. Like, anybody in that huddle is like, what are you talking about, Keith? This is not where we want to be. But Keith is like, guys, we have them right where we want them. Tonight, we're looking at a story where Jacob seems to be caught between two burning bridges, all right? That's where the story leaves us in the context of Jacob's life in the book of Genesis. Jacob has burnt the bridge with his father-in-law Laban. That's exactly what we looked at last week. He has used deceitful practices. Laban, as Jacob is fleeing with all of his household from Laban, Laban catches up to him. The result of this is Laban says, never come back. Complete burnt bridge. And so Jacob, we find him in this story, he's going back to the land of his family, just as God has told him, but there's a problem. The problem is there's a burnt bridge there too. Because Jacob, as he's going back to his family, has to come across his brother Esau. And what happens with Esau, the last story that we have of Esau, the words that he mutters is that I'm going to kill my brother Jacob. Because here's what has happened. Jacob has gone in and deceived his father, acting as Esau, and he's stolen Esau's blessing. And so Esau is writhing up in anger, and he wants to kill his brother. Those are the literal last words that we have of Esau. And now Jacob is coming up to the border of where his brother is, and he has another burnt bridge. He's in between two burnt bridges. And in our story, Jacob is in a rock in a hard place. He's just moments away from encountering his brother. And what we'll see is that God has Jacob right where he wants him. God intends to use this moment in Jacob's life in a profound way. As we walk through the story sequentially, here's what we're going to find in Jacob's life. Jacob is brought low, literally and figuratively. Jacob is desperate. He's at his wit's end, and he's trying to find the solution. And then God uses this to change Jacob. Like, Jacob is literally a changed man from this story on. So we're going to consider this story in those three movements. And here's what here's like my prayer for us tonight, all right? As we're wrestling with this story, my prayer is that as we look at how God uses this story and how he works in Jacob's story to show him how he is changing his life, that as we see the way that God has changed Jacob's life and he intervenes in this particular story, my prayer is that God would help us see our story and Jacob's story and how he's been working through our story to change us. That's my prayer for us tonight. Like, I want us to literally look at Jacob's story and find ourselves in him and look at how God has been working through your life in order to make you more like Jesus. And so for us to do that, we have to start where Jacob is low. And we find that in verses 22 through 24. So here's what it says. During the night, Jacob got up and he took his 2 wives, his 2 slave women, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of Jabbok. He took them and sent them across the stream along with all his possessions, and Jacob was left alone. So Jacob is in a low position here, literally and figuratively. So Jabbok, it was a river, and it's at the feet of the mountains of Gilead. All right, so put that in context. It's 45 miles below the Sea of Galilee. So it is a low place. Some of the river actually runs beneath ground because it's so low. All right? And so Jacob literally is in a low place, but the river is a perfect depiction of Jacob's personal position because Jacob himself personally is really low. The place that we find Jacob here is that he's completely vulnerable and he's completely alone. Jacob is left bare. We find this in the details of verses 22 and 23, all right? So think about this, all right? We get very specific numbers if you were to go back and look at verses 22 and 23. What we find is Jacob and he takes his 2 wives, and he takes his 2 slave women, and then he takes his 11 sons, and then he has all of his possessions, literally all the things that have been brought with him. They are all taken across the river. Everything and everyone that Jacob loves has been sent across this river, and they are completely susceptible to destruction. I mean, it's like his heart is living outside of his chest. He is left completely vulnerable. Everything he prizes in this life is taken away from him. It's on the other side of the river. And then what verse 24 puts is that Jacob is completely alone. All right, so it's nighttime as this is happening. He's sleepy. He's also been getting all of the people and all of his things across the river, so he's also wet and cold. And verse 24 is meant to hit us like a bag of bricks. Jacob was left alone. Now, what's shocking about this is if you look at the very beginning of this story, is that we see this is how God is actually answering Jacob's prayer. This is where God has Jacob in light of a personal experience with him, as well as a desperate prayer to God. This is the way that God is working in Jacob's life. He's making him low. This beginning of the story starts with God coming to Jacob through a couple of angels. Literally, he's traveling towards the land of his family. And verse 1 starts, God's angels met him there. And so Jacob is feeling some confidence. He sends some messengers ahead of himself to go talk with his brother Esau. They come back and the report is dreadful. Nothing good. They just say, hey, Esau is on his way and he has 400 men with him. And Jacob's terrified. I mean, he's shaking in his boots. And so what we see happen here is that Jacob does what he always does. He starts scheming. He breaks up his camp into different divisions. He has these gifts that he's going to send ahead to try to entice his brother. And so he's scheming just like he's always done. And he's just hoping maybe one can survive. If Esau confronts one camp, maybe they'll just keep him enough for the other camp to get away and maybe they'll survive. But then we also find that Jacob prays. And commentators say the way that Jacob prays is that he's asking God for deliverance, but it's as if he's asking that God would send someone for him to deliver him from his brother. And so God's answer to this prayer and this personal encounter with him, he doesn't make things better, he makes them worse. We read this and we're like, how could God do this? Like, how is this loving? If we have a personal encounter with God and we come to God with deep requests that are desperate, we expect that we're going to get bigger houses, that we're going to get greater wealth, that we're going to step into a life of ease and comfort. We don't expect that things are going to get worse, but that's exactly what happens here. It's as if God is saying to Jacob, with his desire for flourishing, God is instead stepping in and saying, I know exactly what I'm doing. As Jacob is at his wit's end, and he's probably questioning a lot about God, God's saying, I know exactly what I'm doing. Jacob needs to be brought to a place of helplessness because he has a dependency problem in his life. Throughout Jacob's life, we just constantly see that he is using his skills and his craftiness in order to make life happen for himself. And here's how one commentator put it: Jacob is self-reliant. He believes himself to be more than a match for anything that might come, but now he senses his complete inability to handle things. In other words, God has Jacob right where he wants him. God is using all the events in Jacob's life to get Jacob in the position that he wants him and needs him in. And what we see in this part of the passage is that God's infinite wisdom is on full display, because this is what, if we are the authors of this story, none of us are working the story out like this. We live in a country that is so comfortable, yet we are so living with constant fear of pain in our life. So if we're the ones that are in authority in this particular story here, we're not working the story out this way. Especially if we're in Jacob's shoes. Like, no way are we saying this is the way the story is going to tease out, but we see God's infinite wisdom. He is bringing Jacob low because he sees something in Jacob that Jacob can't see in himself that must be dealt with. And it's his dependency problem. So God, in his infinite wisdom, is working through the story in Jacob's life to bring him low so that he can do an incredible work in his life. Isaiah 55 puts it like this: for my thoughts are not your thoughts, and your ways are not my ways. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. That's exactly what God is doing here in Jacob's life. Jacob, he's thinking about the promise that God has given him. He's thinking about how he has a birthright, how he has the family blessing, all of these things, the promises of God for him, and yet he finds himself really low. And God is saying, I have you right where I want you. So this is only the setup. God brings Jacob low, but he's going to draw out Jacob's desperation next, which is what we find in verses 24 through 26. Here's what we find in verse 24. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. Can you imagine? You feel like everything has been stripped from you, you're left alone, and then your worst nightmare happens, so you're attacked. When the man saw that he could not defeat him, speaking of the intruder, he struck Jacob's hip socket as they wrestled and dislocated his hip. Then he said to Jacob, let me go, for it is daybreak. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. Now, I need to pause here, all right, because I need to point out some stuff for us. There's a turning point that happens in this story in Jacob's life. And it's when the encounter of the intruder strikes Jacob's hip. All right, so here's what's happening, all right? Struck in our translation that we're looking at tonight is more commonly translated as the merest touch. Just a light and gentle touch that happens. So there's a lot of wrestling. There's a lot of fighting. Like literally the word here is that there's dust being kicked up into the air. God has come and he's brought an attack on Jacob's life, which is wild, right? And in the midst of all of this, there's a mere touch to Jacob's hip and it's completely dislocated. And from that moment, what you see happen is that the wrestle goes from trying to get the intruder away, trying to wrestle the intruder away from Jacob, to now the whole story turns to where Jacob is trying to wrestle to keep the intruder. There's a complete shift that happens with Jacob's perception of what's going on. First, he's trying to get himself rid of the intruder. Now he's trying to cling with desperate grips to this intruder. And in the last line is where you see that desperation. The intruder says, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." And Jacob says, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Look, when you find the solution to the place of desperation in your life, what you do when you encounter that is you try to put your grip on it as tightly as you possibly can. And that's exactly what Jacob has experienced with this encounter with the intruder. He has experienced where someone is more powerful than himself, that by a mere touch on his hip, he is made limp for the rest of his life. He encounters an experience with somebody more powerful than himself, and he's finally met his match. And since he's met his match in the midst of such incredible pain of having your hip dislocated, he does everything he can to keep his grip on this intruder, to keep him in his life rather than ridding him of his life, because he is desperate for what this man can actually provide him. God has Jacob exactly where he wants him. And Jacob is finally desperate for God. That's what we find in verses 27 through 28. Here's what it says. The intruder asks, "What is your name?" What is your name? To which Jacob replies with his very name, Jacob. Now, this is a quick sequence. Here's what you need to understand. In this real time, this is probably a long, drawn-out, painful interaction. Not just like physically, but actually internally. Because what the intruder is asking here is not just Jacob's name, he's asking for a confession. It's as if the intruder is asked by Jacob to bless him. And he says, "What is your name?" And then Jacob, coming to the realization of who he is, what he's done, and what his name means, has to confess his very nature to this intruder that is wrestling with him. It's like he's saying this, I'm the deceiver. I'm the heel catcher. I'm the wrestler. He's having to bring his whole nature, his whole story before God in this instance. And look, something extraordinary happens. Here's verse 28. Your name will no longer be Jacob. It'll be Israel, because you have struggled with God and with men and have prevailed. A couple of things happen here, all right? Don't move too quickly past this. First, we see the identity of the intruder. You have struggled with who? Come on, speak to me. You struggle with who? With God. You've struggled with God. And then Jacob is given a new life and a new identity here. Jacob doesn't just get a new name, he gets a new status here. Your name will no longer be. Your name will no longer be the deceiver. When people ask your name from here on out, your name will no longer be, I am the heel catcher. When people, and you introduce yourself and you have this first experience with people, first impression, you no longer have to say, I'm the wrestler. It shall no longer be said of you that you are Jacob, but instead, you are the one who struggled with God and men and won. Look, Jacob will no longer be known as the one who received a blessing through deception. That's how he had to introduce himself in every first encounter in his life, because that was his very nature. But because of this encounter, this wrestling encounter with God, he gets a new name, he gets a new life, a new identity. Now, here's like where I was at with this, though. It's like, okay, that sounds awesome. But like, how did Jacob win? You know? Like, that's the real talk for me. Like, hopefully you're there with me. It's like, how did Jacob win, right? Like, this dude's getting old. The identity of the intruder has been brought to us. It's the identity of God. How in the world did Jacob win? Well, he won the same way that my boys beat me in wrestling matches at home. God lets them. All right, look, my boys, I got 4 boys. I have a picture. I couldn't find it. I was going to throw it up on the screen, but like, man, it's like WWE when I come home, right? Like, they come and it's WrestleMania in our house. They come, they attack me as soon as I walk in. But man, I would break them in half. You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm not a big dude, but I would break my boys in half. When But you know what happens? My boys win. When they get in wrestling matches with Dad, my boys win. The same thing happens in this encounter with Jacob and God. God lets him win. Tim Keller aptly puts it that this is to remind us of the cross. Jesus endured the fight of eternity on the cross. Look, he was wounded for our sake. He's on the cross. He's deeply, severely wounded for our sake. Yet in the middle of the fight, what does Jesus do? Jesus holds on tightly to us. He's on the cross because of us. He's on the cross for you and me. He's bearing our wounds. And he's doing it for us. He's holding on to us. It's like Jesus is on the cross and he's saying, I won't let go until you bless them, Father. Jesus receives the blows on the cross for our sin, the just blows, so that we would only receive the blows of discipline in our life. The blows of love, y'all. Like whenever Jesus takes on the blows that we could not withstand, he gives himself up to them. So now any type of blows that we get now are actually for our good and are to make us holy. And in the midst of it, God gives you his name. Your identity is changed just like Jacob's. You no longer have to divulge your nature like Jacob did whenever you share your name. I was the deceiver, I was the heel catcher, I was the wrestler. That's our story too. Every one of you, whether man or woman, could introduce yourself as Jacob. But what does God do? He gives you his name. First Christians in the Bible are not of Jewish descent. They're the ones that have been brought from afar and in. And what are their names? They're named Christians. Little Christs. You've been given the name of God. New identity. New life. This is your story. This is what happens. God steps in. He lets you win. Jesus does everything for you that you couldn't do for yourself. This is incredible news. So here's what happens in Jacob's life. Jacob is changed. Jacob is a changed man. That's what we find in verses 30 through 31. Jacob then named the place Peniel, which means face of God. For I have seen God face to face, he said, yet my life has been spared. The sun shone on him as he passed by Peniel, limping because of his hip. Look, we see that Jacob is changed here. Look, there's humility. For I have seen God face to face, yet my life has been spared. He understands what's happened. He understands exactly what has happened in this wrestling encounter in Genesis 32. His life has been spared. God let him win. Previous Jacob, I conquered God and man. Here, his heart has been humbled. He sees exactly what has happened. God had him right where he wanted him. And because God was right, Jacob was right where God wanted him, he saw the work that only God could do on a man's heart like Jacob. He's changed. He's humbled. We see this throughout the rest of the story. Genesis 33 is all about Jacob's reconciliation with Esau. In that story, do you know what he calls his brother? He calls him Lord. Not because he's subversively bending the knee to Esau in place of God. His heart has been humbled. He understands what he has done in the past, and he's coming, pursuing reconciliation. He's humbled. He's a changed man. The story keeps going on for Jacob. He's also now dependent. This man that was once self-reliant, from this story on, we see a man whose story has been changed. What we see later is that Jacob's kids have acted in manipulative ways, and he calls them out on it. How could you do this? This man that his name once meant the deceiver, now his life has been so changed and transformed by this encounter with God that he's calling out the manipulative ways in his kids. God calls him up to go to a different place, and he tells Jacob, leave all the idols. And so Jacob goes and he calls all of his kids, and they come and bring all of the idols, and he places them under a tree, and they leave. And the story says that the land is covered with fear for Jacob. Jacob is finally in this place where he's not this self-reliant, prideful, arrogant man, but he's been humbled, he's been lowered, he was desperate, he clung his grips to God, and God completely and absolutely changed him. Look, we have to stop and think about the sequence of what God has been doing here. God strips Jacob, he makes him low. God wrestles with Jacob. God convicts Jacob where he has to give a confession of his nature. And God blesses Jacob finally with a new name, a new identity, a new way of life. God has slowly been revealing to Jacob that the problem behind his problems is not what he once thought it was. Jacob thought the birthright would be the answer in his life. Jacob thought the blessing of the family would be the answer for his life. Jacob thought a wife would be the answer to the problems in his life. Jacob thought that riches and possessions would be the answer to his life, but because God got Jacob exactly where he wanted him, he was finally low. He was finally helpless. He was finally needy. He was finally confronted with the actual solution to all of his problems. And he clung with all of his mighty grip to this God who actually is the one who let him win and transforms his life. Here's what God has been saying to Jacob: a great relationship with me is the solution beyond all solutions. And Jacob finally gets it. Jacob's story is your story. Jacob's story is my story. Like if I look back on my life, I can see moments where God has been trying to work me down to low. I can see times where there's been hardship and suffering and turmoil because he is trying to get me to this place of desperation. And look, God is perfect in getting us to the place where he wants us. I can think back to whenever I was little and my family, we made a really hard move. I was in a town where I had a ton of friends, y'all. I was never alone. I was never alone. It felt like I was flourishing. I mean, I was running track and I was setting conference records in this place. And then God moves us from that town to a different town. And I was low, guys. I went from never being alone to feeling completely alone. I went from Friday nights being filled to Friday nights being left at home where it felt like all I had was God. I went from times physically where I was crippled and I didn't know if I was actually going to live. Like sickness that crippled me with fear to my bones. And I was probably in the place where Jacob was, where he's literally wrestling, like, God, what are you doing? Like, moved here, brand new wife, trying to start a family, a whole life of ministry ahead of me, and now it seems like maybe I won't even get to taste 30. I mean, God's bringing me low. Bringing me to places of desperation where it's like all I have is God. You ever been brought to that place? Like where it feels everything in your life has been completely stripped of you and all that you're left with is God? Friend, what God may be trying to tell you is, I have you exactly where I want you. Because the solution behind all solutions is a great relationship with me. God's so deeply in love with you that he's willing to let hardship enter into your life in order to get you into the place that he needs you in order for you to see your life change for eternity. That's what happens in Jacob's story. That's what happens in our story. And look, this story, I think, is a gift because it gives us a lens by which we can perceive these things when they come up in our life. So I think a lot of times the questions that we have with stories like this is like, okay, this is a great story. Thank you for pointing me to Jesus, but how do I use this in my life? Well, here's what one pastor says about hardships. He puts them in the idea of storms. He says, you are either in the middle of a storm, coming out of a storm, or headed into a storm. And so I think this story gives us three ways to view the storms in our life and patterns by which we can move forward, all right? So here's three images. Hopefully this is helpful to you. The first one, you can use this story as a blueprint. If you're headed into a storm, use this story as a blueprint. You need a plan. As you're going into a storm, as you're going into the chaos, you need a plan. My boys love Legos right now. And man, whenever you pour out a bag of Legos onto the table, it is a storm, right? Such little parts, you have no idea how in the world you're going to make sense of any of it. Well, here's the good news, is you get a blueprint whenever you open up a bag of Legos. They give you the instruction manual that helps you see how to piece each part together in order for you to bring the final vision to completion. Look, I think this story can be as a blueprint for you. As you look at the storm that God brings on Jacob's life and you realize that God is going to be bringing you storms in your life too because he wants to get you to the place that he wants you, I think you can look at Jacob's life here and you can look for patterns, plans for how you get through the storm. Here's what you see with Jacob here. He prays. That's what this whole encounter is. Like, don't overthink what prayer is here, guys. Like prayer is talking to God. What has happened here with Jacob? He's been talking with God. Like he's brought to a place of crippling fear and he comes and he prays to God. God doesn't answer his prayer initially the way that he thought. His life gets worse before it gets better. He's brought low. But then this encounter, this wrestle with God, he wrestles with God in prayer. And what we find is that he's finally brought to this place of desperation as he's wrestling with God in prayer. And his life is transformed, it's changed. So look, whenever you're going into a storm, use this story as a blueprint. You pray. You are a person of prayer. I'm not saying like just as your last ditch effort, you pray. You are a person of prayer. Your desperation is coming and clinging to God by giving your voice, your worries, your concerns, all that may be going on inside of you, you're giving it to God in prayer. You also use this story as a compass. If you're in the middle of a storm, you should use this story like a compass. Because in the middle of a storm, life is chaotic, life is messy, and we tend to lose our way. Don't we? Like whenever things hit, like we just get so altered, don't we? I mean, we get so disoriented. We can't make sense of the direction by which we are to head. But when you're in the middle of a storm, you use this story to help you find your bearings. You see what God does with Jacob, he transforms his life. He uses hardship to make him more like Jesus. He brings him to a place of lowness and desperation so he can finally find the solution to his life. Look, whenever you're going through hardships and you're going through a storm, you need to ask, what truths do I need to remember here? When it feels like God has turned his back on you, when you're wondering if he even loves you, is he even committed to me, like the way that we talked about in weeks prior to this, you have to remind yourself of truth. The beautiful thing about the Bible is it says that it's like a lantern that goes a light on the path. It goes before our feet. It shines the way forward for us. Look, you need wisdom in times of storms. Where do you go? You go to the Bible. You go to stories like this that tell you the truth. What truth do I need in my life when it feels like I've lost my bearings? Come back and use the story like a compass. And then lastly, use it like a rear view mirror. If you're coming out of a storm, use a story to help you process the past. Rear view mirrors help you see what you have already passed by. So use this story to help you process those storms that you're coming out of. Jacob had a dependency problem and a scheming problem, and God uses this encounter to cling to him and to trust him. Like that's what happens as a result of Jacob's life. And so like, look, if you're coming out of a storm, use a story as a rear view mirror to help you process what you've come out of. What was God trying to teach me in my life here? What is a consistent pattern in my life? If Jacob had a dependency problem, what is my problem? What are the things that God keeps trying to bring me low and bring me to a place of desperation where he's trying to help me see and come to find God as my deepest solution in this life? What is he working in my life? Look, this is God's gift to us. Stories like this are a pattern to help us understand the storms that we're coming out of, the storms that we're going into, or the storms that we're in the middle of. And they remind us of the truth of how God is constantly with you and bringing you along. David Brooks wrote a book a while back called The Road to Character. And it's a book that charts the stories of a lot of influential people and their struggles before becoming consequential in this life. People that their story has some teeth to it. And there is a quote in that book that stuck with me. He says this: recovering from suffering or struggle is not like recovering from a disease. Many people don't come out healed. They come out different. That's Jacob's story. That's your and my story too. Jacob leaves with a limp. Every person with consequence, if you talk to him in this life, every person has a limp. The result of these hardships and these sufferings is that you're changed. Let's pray.